So many people today are still using Active Directory to authenticate their applications, and oftentimes when they set up new workloads, they still just set up the authentication to integrate with Active Directory. So for me, Active Directory is like an old, dying, obsolete technology that uses old authentication protocols and gives us very little functionality. Today we think about modern authentication and identity providers giving us SAML authentication and OpenID Connect, and really the protocol is not that relevant. The important thing is that these modern identity providers, and in my case this is predominantly EntraID, allows us conditional access control, so we can force MFA or control the location or whether devices are compliant and such. And also we don't have servers to manage and patch and have that overhead. Oftentimes I'll ask IT managers or CTOs or whatever from a strategic standpoint, I'll say, do you still want to have these Active Directory servers in 5 years time? And almost without fail, everyone says, no, that's a good point. We don't still want those. So we really need to be making these decisions now. Every time we have a new workload, we need to think about that overarching strategy that we do want to move away from Active Directory and try and make that shift. So today I want to look at SQL Server and how we can shift that authentication away from Active Directory and into EntraID. Let's just jump over into the portal and get into it. So over here in the Azure portal, I'll just quickly show you what I've got here. I've got no virtual machines yet. We're going to deploy that together today. I've got a hub and spoke network topology with Azure Bastion deployed so we can remote on, and that's really it. So here's my spoke network. There's a lot of stuff in there, but this is because I used this network on a previous demo. But really, we're just going to deploy a virtual machine into the database or SQL subnet that already pre-exists here. So here we go. We're going to deploy it onto that DB subnet there. So to that end, let's sort of get into it. Just before we actually deploy the server, I jump over to the documentation of what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to deploy a SQL Server 2022. That's the minimum server version that supports EntraID authentication for SQL Server. And I'm also going to deploy I'll share this link in the show notes. So I'll just check this in the show notes. If I jump down to basically what I'm going to try and do, here's the prerequisites: SQL Server 2022. Obviously with the SQL extension, we'll choose that out of the box. I'm going to use a user assigned identity. So bear in mind that a system assigned identity will work here. I quite like the user assigned identity because in my environments, I have a lot of these SQL servers. So instead of going and giving the permissions required to lots of system assigned identities, I just have one single user assigned identity that can read the directory. And I think that's really the key here. There's a few ways to grant that. And the simplest way, if we just scroll down a little bit here, is to give that identity the appropriate role, which is the direct reader's role. So let's just jump in and do that. So if I go to my managed identities, and I'll just go ahead and create one here. So I'm going to chuck this managed identity in my management resource group, which is I'm sort of using for some artifacts in terms of management. So that can sit in there. I'm in New Zealand, so still the closest data center to us is Australia East, but we're almost there with New Zealand North getting launched. Can't wait for that day. And I'm going to give my user assigned managed identity a meaningful name. So UAI for user assigned. It's going to be for SQL Entra authentication. That's the purpose of this identity, and that's really all I need. Oh, okay, that's deployed. Now let's jump back to our resource groups here. We're going to need a new resource group for our SQL virtual machine. So I'll quickly create that resource group up front, and I'm just going to call that I'm going to prefix it with RG for resource group and give it the name of the VM. So let's go RG, and it's going to be, for me, it'll be VM, and let's say demo SQL and O1 in that region. So I've got SM there, change that to V. And I'm just going to store that in my clipboard because I'll use that for the name of the VM, and that's also going to be in Australia East. Cool, and that resource group's deployed, so let's jump into there, and I'm going to create our virtual machine. So I'm just going to choose an image from the marketplace. Okay, so we're going to go with SQL Server 2022 standard on Windows Server 2022. So the key here is that the SQL Server version is 2022. Cool, okay, so I'll just quickly fill out these details. I'm going to go with the name that I sort of created before for the resource group, so VM Demo SQL 01, chuck it in Australia East. For the purposes of this demo, the things that I choose here are not particularly important. It's just so long as I have SQL Server 2022. So I'll just fill this in and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, awesome. So our SQL Server is finally deployed. I can jump over there, and just before I do that, there's one thing I forgot to do earlier with the user assigned identity, which is actually give it some permission. So let's jump over to Entra and go to roles and administrators, and what it needs is the directory reader role. So let's search for that. Here we are, directory readers, and add the assignment and just search for my user assigned identity. Tick that box, hit add, and that should be everything that it needs to actually read the directory. Cool, okay, let's jump back to our virtual machine, or I'll jump to the resource group and associate the identity with the virtual machine itself, and that will need to do that first, otherwise we can't use the identity in the SQL configuration. So in the virtual machine, if I go to identity and jump over to user assigned, I want to just add there's only one here, so add my user assigned identity. So we've got that association. While it does that, I'll just jump across to the SQL extension. And what I want to do is jump down into the security configuration and enable Entra authentication here. And in the drop-down box, I'm going to go with user assigned identity, as we sort of discussed earlier. And there's just going to be the one here. Now, if you didn't do the previous step of associating the identity with the virtual machine, you won't see anything in this drop-down. So you've got to do that step first. Select the identity and hit apply. And that's pretty much all we need to do. From the setup standpoint, once that deployment's complete, we just need to log into the server and set up our authentication. So we can jump in here. Because I've got Bastion set up, it should allow me to connect here with Azure Bastion. Cool, that looks like it's going through, and the SQL, the Entra auth seems to have been enabled successfully. So we'll just jump into SQL Server Management Studio, and we're gonna have to do that with our local account first, because there won't be any EntraID accounts in there from the get-go, and then we can add the login from Entra. Okay, so I'm logged in here as the local admin account, so I should just be able to use Windows Authentication to authenticate. So let's go ahead and give that a crack. Cool, nice and easy, we're in. So let's jump over to security logins, and I want to create a login for an EntraID user. So let's go new login, and I'm just going to use my admin account that I've been using, paste that in there, and I want to choose EntraID authentication for the authentication, and I'll just hit, let's give him a server role. So I'll go, the account's going to be my sysadmin. And there you go, so he's been joined. I just want to point out that I equally could, if I go to new logins, I could totally do an EntraID group if I want a group of users to be my SQL administrators. So that's going to work equally well. So next, I just want to validate that authentication is going to work. So let's open up another instance of SQL Server Management Studio. Cool, okay, what I want to do is choose Microsoft Entra with MFA, and I'll chuck in my user account there. I want to trust the certificate of the server and hit connect. Okay, so it's bringing me to a modern authentication experience. I'll just copy and paste my password across. Awesome, and that's sort of, it's nice that it's showing that authentication, bringing up the MFA, because it demonstrates, I guess, one of the main reasons why we want to move to these modern authentication mechanisms. And hopefully, fingers crossed, that's now logged me in. Okay, cool, so I'm logged in with my EntraID account. So that's all I really wanted to cover today. Hopefully that helps you move away from Active Directory in the long run. Until the next one, have a good one.